In this devlog, we'll be doing our first live coding session. We'll be creating a Rails 5 application from scratch, seeing what gems we usually use, what things we usually remove. We'll also be focusing on creating an API layer, as well as using the revealing pattern on the JS side, or in the front end, and the command pattern on the back end to implement certain business rules. Now, the application I'll be creating is a banking application. It's actually one of the first activities that we did back in college in our first programming, in my first programming course. And it's actually a good exercise to practice things like object-oriented design and fundamentals of programming, like declaring variables, methods, and user-defined objects. So for this application, we might want to have a model that will capture client information, wherein a client will have a first name, a last name, and a middle name. A client would also have a client number, which is the unique identifier for this particular client, which is not necessarily the primary key of the client in the database. This application will also have a model for a bank account that references a client, meaning a bank account will belong to a client, and a client can have multiple bank accounts, like a savings or a checking account. And of course, that bank account will have a balance as well as an account number. Decimal for balance and string for account number. Okay, we migrate that to the database. And maybe we will have one more model for the actual transactions for the bank account. So we'll call it account transaction. And it will have an amount as well as an account, or rather a transaction type. Okay, the transaction type will dictate if this transaction is either a withdrawal or a deposit from a particular bank account. So we actually have to reference a bank account. And of course, the bank account will have multiple account transactions for it. Okay, so we'll just be playing with 3 models for this application. Now, the next thing I'll do is I'll first, before starting things, I'll first include the necessary gems I need for this particular demo. And one of the common gems I use for a new project, well, for the front end, is to use Bootstrap 3 more specifically. And for that, I use the Bootstrap Sass gem. Now, I don't really use turbolinks for the application, but I heard that turbolinks in Rails 5 has actually come a long way. But I'm not really fond of turbolinks, so I'll just go ahead and remove that. But something to keep in mind if you're not using turbolinks, and that is to go to the layout file of your application and remove the turbolink reference in the layout file. We have one right here and another one for the JavaScript. Another useful gem that I use whenever I'm starting a new project is the haml gem, which is an HTML templating engine that allows me to write shorthand HTML, as we'll see later on. Okay, so I think those are the 2 gems that I usually use for a very basic Rails application. Okay, so we bundle install to install all the gems, these 2 gems inside my application. Okay, the next thing I'll do is I'll configure the models, the client, the bank account, and the account transaction, and include some very basic rules, such as validating that a client should always have a first name, as well as the last name and middle name. And we'd also like a string representation of an instance of a client, which can be done by overwriting the toS method of an active record model, So in this case, the string representation of a client will be the client's last name, comma, the client's middle name, first name, followed by the client's middle name. I'd also like to validate the client's client number and make sure that this one is actually a unique value. Okay, another rule I'd like to implement is that the names of the client, the first, middle, and last name of the client, should always be uppercase. So I can do this by putting a callback function before save and save format name. So before a client record is actually saved to the database, it will call this method format name, which will force all the first name of the client to be uppercase, as well as the middle and last name. Okay, so once we have that in place, let me just fix these equal signs so it becomes evenly aligned. Okay, so once we have that in place, the next model will implement certain rules with certain rules will be the bank account model. So a bank account belongs to a client, and we'll always make sure that a bank account will have a client. So validates client, presents true. For the account number, it's the same as the client number. Account number should be present as well as unique. Okay. And the toString version, or the toS method of a bank account, will simply return that bank account's account number. Of course, it should always have a balance, and that balance should be a number. Now, before a bank account gets saved to the database, I'll have to ensure that it should always have a balance. So I might have a callback function before validation, load default, so that before an instance of a bank account can be validated, it will call this method load defaults, where I can insert my balance. So I'll first have to check if this instance is a new record. If so, I'll set the balance to 0. Okay, so I think that should work for the bank account. And since the bank account belongs to a client, I can declare that the client can have many bank accounts. So has many bank accounts, which will allow me to pull all the bank accounts of a particular client when needed. The last model will modify is the account transaction. Just like the bank account that belongs to a client, an account transaction will belong to a bank account. So I have to validate the bank account to always be present. Okay. I'll also have to validate the amount. It should always have an amount, and that amount should always be a number. I should also have a transaction number for this account transaction. And I can't remember if I actually included it in the right, I don't have a transaction number yet for this particular table, so I'll have to migrate, or I'll have to add that column. But for the transaction type, it has to be present, and it always has to have it has to have a value that should only be of two things, a withdrawal or a deposit. And to do that, I'll probably have a constant transaction types, which can only hold the values withdraw, which will contain the values withdraw and deposit. Okay. So this validation right here will tell the application that for the field transaction type, it can only account for the values withdraw and deposit. Okay. And I'd like to have a transaction number for each account transaction, but I forgot to include it when I created the model. So what I'll do is I'll have to create a new migration file that will add transaction number to the table of account transactions. Add transaction number to account transactions, and the transaction number is actually a string. Okay, so once we migrate that, if you check the schema of our account transactions, you can see that we have the transaction number field right there. So going back to the model, I can then validate that field and say that the transaction number should always be present and it should always be unique. Okay, and some things I can add before validating a transaction, an account transaction. I'd like the system to assign a transaction number every time a new transaction is created. So to do that, it's the same thing that I did with the bank account. I'll first check if this thing is a new record. If so, I'll set the transaction number to some random string. So let's say I'll use secure random.uuid to actually create a random transaction string. A very unique random transaction number string. Okay, so you can use any method that you see fit to generate the transaction number, but just for this example, I'll just generate a UUID for the transaction number. Okay, so now that we have all our models in place, the next thing to do is probably integrate the Bootstrap CSS and JS resources. So I included the gem file I included the gem bootstrap Sass in our gem file, and to include the necessary files from Bootstrap in the JS side of things. Oh, I forgot to remove turbo links here. I won't be using that. And I also I'm not really fond of requiring everything in the application.js, but rather I'd like to include JavaScript only when it's needed, as we'll see later on. So I'll remove required 3 for now, and I'll require the Bootstrap JS files. Okay, so that's all you need to include the Bootstrap JS resources into your Rails application, if you're using the Bootstrap Sass gem. For the application style sheets, or the application.css file, the first thing we have to do is to rename this to application.scss. After doing that, we'll import 2 lines, or we'll import 2 things: Bootstrap sprockets and the actual Bootstrap CSS framework. Okay. And that's all you need to integrate Bootstrap CSS into your application. Okay. So I guess now will be a good time to test if our application is running. So I'll start the Rails server, and I should have the default homepage for Rails. So I'll have to override this homepage by defining my own route path by going to the routes file and say that the application will route to pages index. So this is a convention I'd like to use. For static pages, I have a controller called pages controller that governs all these static pages. So I'll have to create a pages controller file. Class pages controller extends application controller with a method index. Now this one will be mapped to a view. Okay, so I don't have the directory for my pages yet, so I'll have pages right there, which is the same name as the controller, pages controller, pages views right there. And I'll have my index.html file. Now, if you notice, I'll be using haml from this point onwards instead of your usual ERB file. Now, haml is a shorthand HTML. It will allow you to write HTML using a shorthand approach, meaning I'll actually code less to get my HTML stuff inside this particular page. So for example, if I had a div right here that had a class container, for example, and in that container I'd have a row and in that row I'd have something like call md12. In haml, you can actually write this entire thing by using the percent sign followed by the name of the HTML element. And if you wanted to attach a class to it, you can just use the dot notation for declaring a class. So in this case, I have a div that has a class called container. I can have a div that's of class row and a div that's of class called md12. Okay. The nice thing about this is that I don't need a closing tag, because haml assumes that whatever is indented from this parent element will be the nested element for this container element. Okay, so this entire thing is synonymous to this entire thing. Okay. In fact, since divs are very common, then we can rewrite that thing as something like .container, .row, .call md12. So these three blocks of code are actually the same exact thing. If you don't explicitly define an HTML element, haml will treat this .container as a div element with a container class. Okay, so both work the same way. Okay, so let me just remove this thing, and I'll just put a header here and say my bank. Okay, so in this case, the my bank string is inside, or is nested within this h1 tag. So if I refresh my page, this should show me the my bank string under an h1 element tag. Okay, so it's taking a bit to load. Okay, so we have it right there, and as you can see, the bootstrap styling's already kicked in, as opposed to your default browser style. Okay, one thing I have to do is, in my layout file, I'll just wrap everything under a container, so we have some nice padding for the contents of my page. Oh, was it container or container? Right, so it's container, and then in the index page, I can probably wrap this around row call md12, and then a bunch of stuff here. Let's see if this works. Okay, I don't think the container is kicking in. I can't remember the div class container. Bootstrap grid. Yeah, it's div class container. So oh, sorry, wrong spelling. Container. Okay, there we go. Okay, so if you refresh this, we have a nice padding or a nice alignment for our application. Okay, so going back to the main application, what I'd like to do is I'd like to have some stuff in here, right? For example, I'd like to display the accounts, or the number of accounts in the system, as well as the number of clients. Okay, so if you can see right here, this entire string has the hashtag curly brace syntax, which suggests that we're actually interpolating this Ruby variable number of accounts into this string. Okay, so one way to display values from Ruby, or to render Ruby values into your haml file, is by using the hashtag curly brace syntax and pass the variable that you'd like to render. If I refresh this won't work because we don't have the number of accounts and number of clients variable yet. So to solve this problem, I'll put these variables, or these actually methods, inside my application helper. Okay, so my application helper, okay, will contain these utility methods, number of accounts and number of clients. And all it will do is that it will count the bank accounts found in the system as well as the number of clients. Okay. So if I refresh this, I should have 0 accounts and 0 clients in my application. The next thing I'll do is I'll provide a link, so when the user clicks on that link, it will show a table of all the accounts that are present in this application. Now, to create a link in haml, what we can do is we can call the link to helper, and to use that helper function, we have an equal sign here. Okay, so it works just like something like in ERB link to. In haml, we disregard that tag and we just use the equal sign. So it's the same thing as your ERB declaration of link to. So we do something like link to bank accounts path do, and then embed a string inside the link to helper function, something like bank accounts. Okay, so the reason why I do this is because I like to be more flexible in terms of the contents of the ahref tag that's being rendered by link to. So if I had something like font awesome, I can do something like font awesome declaration of building, for example, or whatever other styles I need for the embedded content of the ahref tag. So if I refresh this, it should produce an error because I don't have the bank accounts path yet. So to do that, I'll go to my routing file again and declare the path as a set of resources for bank accounts. Now for this example, I'll only need the index and the show method of the resources path. Okay. So to implement these routes, I'll have to have a bank accounts controller, okay, which looks exactly like the pages controller. So I'll just copy this thing, paste it there. Bank accounts controller, and it will only have index and show. Now the convention is that for show, I'll start with show, we can fetch a single resource for a bank account by using the params ID, or the ID parameter that's passed to this particular route. So I can do bank account.find params ID. Okay, that's a convention. It's expected that the path will have an ID parameter that we can use to search a bank account in our database. For the index, I'll just throw all the bank accounts found in the system by doing a select all against the bank account. Okay, so if I have the controller for bank accounts, I should have a directory for my bank account pages. In this case, I'll have a directory called bank accounts. Inside that will be my index and my show page. Okay. Now in index, I'll probably have, let's say, a header, bank accounts, and a table. Okay, let me use the CSS rules provided by Bootstrap. The table and table bordered, and I'll have columns that will display the account number, the balance of that account, and probably another column for the actions, or what I can do with a given bank account record. And in my tbody, I'll loop through all the bank accounts. In haml, we do that, we provide some logical operation by using the dash syntax as opposed to the equal syntax, which displays a value in your HTML page. Okay, so for each bank account, I'll create a tr tag and display that bank account's account number, as well as that bank account's balance. Now for currencies, there's this helper function called number to currency to format a number to a currency format. And you can actually explicitly tell what unit to use for the currency. In this case, I'll be using P for peso. And it will format the balance value nicely for our application. Now for the actions, I'll have a link to the bank account path, which requires the bank account's ID. And I'll say something like show. In fact, I can actually add a class here. Let's say button primary. So it will display the link as a button in our application. So if I refresh this, we can see that we have a nice link right there. If I click it, since I don't have any bank accounts yet, we'll have an empty table right there. So I won't create the UI for inserting bank accounts. Instead, I'll insert bank accounts in the console so I can immediately test if my validations are working. So let's say I create a new bank account. The bank account will actually require a client. So I guess before even creating a bank account, I should have a client. Okay, provided client's first name. Middle name. I'm not concerned with the case sensitivity of the values for the names because the model will change them to uppercase anyway. Let's say the client number is this client number. Okay, so it successfully inserted a client record. So now that I have a client, I can reference it, or I can fetch the last client and store it in a variable called client, so I can create my bank account for that client. Client will be client, and the account number will be something like 00001. Okay, and that's all I need. So it successfully inserted a bank account entry in the database that belongs to the client that I just created. Notice that I didn't insert the balance value because it will default to 0 anyway. So if I exit that and refresh my page, you can see that I have the account number right there together with the balance. So if I click the show link, which goes to the show page of the bank account, I can then display values such as, well, of course, you have the account number. Let me interpolate the account number right there, and probably a small tag to show the client's the client that actually owns this account. Okay, so we have it right there. Now for the show page of the bank account, I'd like to have a table containing all the transactions for this given bank account. So I might have a table right here, table bordered, wherein it will show the date of transaction, the amount of the transaction, the transaction type, and the transaction type. Okay. So for that given bank account, I'd like to loop through all the transactions of this bank account. I'll just use the variable t to hold each instance of the account transaction. Okay, so we have an error right here. I think it requires to have some string right there. Okay, so now we have an error account transactions that we are trying to call from @bank account. So I guess in my bank account model, I forgot to include the has many declaration of account transactions. The same way I declare has many bank accounts for a given client, I'll have to declare has many account transactions because each account transaction actually belongs to a bank account. Okay. And then for each of those transactions, I display the created @value, which is already provided in Rails thanks to Active Record. And for the amount, I'll use the helper again, number to currency, t.amount unit p. And of course, for the transaction type, t.transaction type. Okay, let me interchange the order. So I'll have the date of transaction first before the actual amount. So it will be read like something like deposit 500, withdraw 50, and so on and so forth. Okay, refresh this, then I have my table for my account number. Another thing I can do is that at the end of the table, I might have another row that will display the balance of the bank account. So I might have something like balance. I can actually have a th for that. And this one will hold the balance of the current bank account. Okay. Since it's a number, it's a currency, I can use the helper number to currency unit p. Okay, so it will have a table that will display all the transactions, and at the end of it, it will display the total balance of the account. So I'll have something like that. Balance 0 pesos. Okay, some other things that I can modify, or I can add. I'd like to have a button, let's say a button tag, that will serve as an action item, so that when the user clicks it, a modal will pop up and I can perform either a deposit or withdrawal. Okay. Add a class to it, something like button primary, do new transaction. Okay, refresh this. Okay, so we have that button right there, and what I want is, if I click this button, I'd like a modal to pop up using Bootstrap's modal, which will contain the input elements for the transaction operation. Okay, so at this point, what I'll probably do is I'll start integrating some JavaScript so I can interact with this button. Now, the way I do it is that in my JavaScript folder, I'll create a single JavaScript for this particular page. So just like what we did in the views, I'd like to organize my JavaScript according to resource. So I might have a folder called bank accounts. And inside that folder, I'll have a show.js, which is for this particular page. Okay. So to include that, I'll have to use the tag JavaScript include tag bank accounts /show. Okay. Remember, we're not requiring this JS in our application.js. We'll only include it in the page whenever we need it. All right. So if I try to refresh this page again, it will produce an error because if you want to include this JS file only when this page is rendered, you'd have to include it in the Rails.application config assets precompile part of your assets.rb file. So let's go to assets.rb file, and it's actually commented out there. And I'll just pass an array to it containing the location of the JavaScript that I'd like to precompile. In this case, it's in bank accounts show.js. Okay. So this will precompile it, but we'll have to restart the server every time we have a new file that's included in the precompilation process. Okay. And just to prove that it works, going back to the JavaScript file, let's just alert hello world. Make sure that that JavaScript is actually being referenced in the page. Okay, so we have that hello world right there. Okay, now at this point, I'd like to show how to use what's called the revealing pattern in JavaScript, just so we'll have the code, our code organized, organized and more maintainable in the long run. So the revealing pattern starts out with a variable. So let's say var show, whose value is actually what's called a self-executing function. Okay. And inside that, it will have a return value, an object, which will contain the only things that will be revealed to the page that's calling this JavaScript. So in this case, let's say I'd only like to reveal some initialized function called init. So I'll have it right here. Var init is equal to a function. And let's say that init, the only thing that init does is that it alerts hello world. Okay. Going back to our show page, let's just make sure that it works. Okay. So in haml, you can have a JavaScript tag by issuing the command :JavaScript. And in there, I'll have my Jquery stuff and wait for the page to load before I actually call the init function for the variable show. Now, in order to call this, we use the following syntax: show.init. Okay. So if I refresh this page, it should still print out hello world as expected. Now, looking at the console, we can still call that same function right there because that's the only function that's revealed to us from this variable. If we actually had another function in that JavaScript file, let's say var foo equals function, and we don't return it back to the page that's calling this file, if we try to do, let me just refresh this. Okay. If we try to do something like show.foo, it will say that foo is not a function because it's not revealed out to the page that referenced this JavaScript file. Okay. Which allows us to do things like private declarations, things that we don't really want to expose but are stored inside this show object. One such thing we'd like to store will be the input elements of the page. For example, the button new transaction. And the way I do it is that I'd have a variable here, button new transaction. Right? So I know this variable will hold a reference to the new transaction button. And just for convenience, I might have a function here called fetch elements, whose sole purpose is to do just that, fetch the elements that are needed by my application. So in this case, button new transaction will be button new transaction. I'm using Jquery to get those elements according to an ID. Now, I might also have a function that will initialize the events for my input elements. So in this case, my input element, new transaction, I'll have an event on click, and let's say it will issue the alert hello world. Hello world. Okay, so once that's in place, I can call the fetch elements function in my init function so that when I call .init, it will invoke fetch elements. After fetching those elements, I can then initialize the events for my elements. Okay. So with this approach, I have my JavaScript code organized in such a way that I know what's actually happening. Like if I initialize this show.js thing, I know that I'll fetch the elements and I'll initialize the events for each element. So it becomes much more readable and self-documenting as well. Okay, so let's try that out. It will only alert hello world whenever I click the button new transaction. Just refresh this. Okay, so it's not working. Fetch elements, button new transaction, button new transaction. That's correct. On click, function alert hello world, initialize events after we fetch elements. So yeah, it should work. Okay, so apparently it's not querying the element properly. So let me just go back to the button and see. Oh, okay. So I actually named it button transaction instead of button new transaction. Okay, so that's why it wasn't working. Okay, so now I'm using the proper name for the ID. If I refresh this and click this, okay, it should print out hello world. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to implement is that if I click this button, I'd like to have a modal pop up with the input elements for creating a new transaction. So I'll go ahead and cheat and look for a modal the Bootstrap modal written in haml. Okay, so I think I'll use this gist since someone already created a haml version of the modal. So I'll copy this and I'll put it in my show page. Just zoom out a bit. Okay, I'll put it somewhere here. Okay. Now haml is very strict about indentation to define nested events, so we'll have to fix these things. Okay, so we'll have something like that for the header. Let's see the indentation. I think FA close should be inside span, which should also be inside the button, so something like that. Header will be part of, or modal title will be part of header. So say new transaction. The body will contain the form input elements, and the footer will just be the action button stuff. Okay. For the save, I'll probably remove this thing. Type button. Okay. I'll add an ID to this. So let's say something like button save. So I can reference it in JavaScript. What else do I need? Okay, for the body, I'll start putting in the input elements. So I'll probably have 2 columns. The first one will be for the amount, which is a text field tag. I'll give it have a default value of 0, give it an ID of input amount, and a class of form control. For the transaction type, this will be a select tag. Transaction type, okay, with an options for select, right? And I'll get the possible values from account transaction. Remember, we had a constant there called transaction types, so I'll use that here, and I'll give it an ID, something like select type, okay, and then a class of form control as well. Actually, I'll just be more verbose about it and say transaction type. Okay, let's see if this UI is working. Well, it's not by default. I believe this thing is hidden, so even if I refresh it, I won't be able to see the modal. So I'll use JavaScript to first store the elements that I need. Let me just put an ID right here. I'll just call this modal transaction. Okay, and I'll reference those things in my JavaScript. So modal transaction. I believe I had one for button save as well. And I'll have the variables for input amount and select transaction type. Okay. So for fetch elements, this will add more definitions. So this one is querying modal transaction. This one is for the save button. Save button save. This one is for input amount. Input amount. This one is for select transaction type. Select transaction type. Okay, so my obsessive compulsive self is kicking in, so I'd like to actually align these things. Okay, and actually even sort them. Oops, sorry, sort them alphabetically. Same goes for this one. Alright, so I have them sorted out, and I'd like to initialize events. So whenever the user clicks button new transaction instead of alert, I'll show the modal. So modal transaction dot modal show. Yeah, I think that's how we do it in Bootstrap JavaScript. So if I refresh this page and click new transaction, okay, it should show me the modal with the input elements withdraw and deposit. All right, so the next thing I'll try to implement is that if I click the save button, I should be able to do two things. First is to disable these buttons and the input elements so that the user will not be able to modify them. And second is to get these values from the interface. Okay, let's try that out. So when I click button save, so button on click, function, okay, on click, I first like to disable the controls. But I'd also like to enable the controls later on. So maybe I'll have a utility function called disable controls, which is a function, and all it does is that it will disable my button save. I think we can do that using prop disabled true. Same goes for the input amount, prop input amount dot prop disabled true select transaction type prop disabled true. Okay, to disable the controls. And I'll also have an enable controls function that will set these values to false, okay, so that these controls will be activated again. Okay, so let me test that out first. Once I hit button save, it should disable controls. Okay, so I refresh this, new transaction, save will disable those controls. Okay, so now that that's working, and the next thing I'll try to figure out is how to get these values and probably display them on the console. So I'll use those values to pass to the server and actually perform the transaction. Okay, so on click, even before I disable the controls, I'll get the amount from input amount dot val. I'll also get the transaction type from transaction type, select transaction type dot val. Okay, so I have it right there. I'll also need one more thing, which will be the bank account ID. So I'll know which bank account I'm actually performing a deposit or a withdrawal to. So to do that, what I usually do, and this is very unconventional, at least for most developer standards, but I've admittedly used it in some projects. I'll have another section here, or another element here called parameters, that will have a data attribute containing the bank account ID. Okay, and then I'll store the bank account ID right there. Now to actually retrieve this value, going back to show.js, I'll go ahead and create a parameters value for that and query it the same way I'd query any type of element. Parameters. And then for the non-Jquery variables, I'll have something like this, bank account ID. Wherein I'd also initialize it here. Bank account ID is equal to parameters. Remember, we did a data attribute for that particular element. So I can call it by doing parameters.data and then passing the name of the data attribute, which is bank account ID. Take note that haml automatically converts the bank account underscore ID into dashes for the data attribute. So we can actually get the value by doing this syntax. Okay, so let me test it out if it actually worked. I'll just do console.log amount transaction type and bank account ID. So if I refresh this, and let's say I'd like to perform a deposit. Okay. Okay, so it displayed the proper values as expected. Okay, let me refresh that for withdrawal. Save. Okay, so it's able to retrieve the proper values from the input elements. All right, so now that I know that that part is working, I'll leave JavaScript first and go to the server side of things. Where in the server, I'd like to declare an API layer that will capture these values and then perform the actual transaction. So to do that, I'll go first to the route file, and the way I declare an API section for my application is by namespacing it. So in this case, I'd have a namespace for API and an additional namespace for the version of this API. So I might have multiple versions from my API, and I'll namespace it according to that version. And let's say that I have a single post endpoint that goes to bank accounts / new transaction that points to bank accounts controller new transaction. Now the bank accounts controller here is actually different from the bank accounts controller here, because this one is namespaced. It's actually from a namespaced route. So I'll have to create a new controller for that, which should be under a directory called API v1. Okay, and in that I'll have my bank accounts controller. And since this controller is namespaced, the way we declare it is we first declare the module API, followed by a module v1, followed by, sorry, you don't need a do block right there, followed by the actual class. So bank accounts controller. Now I know Rails 5 is an API controller, but for this example, I'll just use application controller instead. And this one will have a single method called new transaction, which will capture the parameters amount, transaction type, and the bank account ID. So just replace amount with transaction type, and this one with bank account ID. Alright, so let me just align these things again. Now, we have a business rule here, and that business rule is to validate things such as if the bank account actually exists, or if, for the case of a withdrawal, if I have enough amounts to actually withdraw from that bank account. So to implement that business rule, I opt to use what's this thing called the command pattern, which is actually very simple. It's the philosophy is that, or the concept is that you have a single class that does a particular operation or a particular business rule, and you pass all the things that are needed to perform that business rule. Okay? So to create that class, I'll create another directory inside my app directory called operations. And I'll also namespace that operations, or I'll also modularize that operation. So something like a bank accounts directory, so that all operations that are involved in bank accounts will be stored inside this directory. So one operation would be to validate new transaction. And this thing is actually just a plain old Ruby object, or a plain old Ruby class. Okay? So the way we declare it is that I'll say module bank accounts class validate new transaction. Now, why did we do module bank accounts instead of module operations? This means that I assume that the operations directory is already included or is already loaded into the Rails application, and all classes underneath it will be included in the context of this application. But Rails doesn't know that yet, and to prove that, if I try to call bank accounts validate new transaction, it will actually give me an error saying that it's uninitialized. So Rails wasn't able to locate this particular class or even this particular module bank accounts. Okay, so to load this path of operations, you'll have to go to the application.rb file and autoload it using rails.application.config.autoload paths, which is actually an array containing the paths that are autoloaded for your Rails application. So in this case, I'd like to load the path found in rails.root. Okay, rails.root, I think, yeah, rails.root/app/operations. Okay. All right, so since I modified the application.rb, I'll have to reload my Rails application by restarting the server. Okay. Once I have that, then I can proceed to implement the validation. So the way the command pattern works is that it has at least two methods: a constructor, which will have all the parameters that are needed, in this case amount, transaction type, and the bank account ID, as well as the execute method, which will perform the logic for this operation. And what I'd like to do is that for this operation, it will return an array of errors in case certain conditions weren't met. So this array of errors is initialized into an @errors instance variable, and I'll just return that after execution. Okay. Aside from that, I should have the instance variables amount, transaction type, and bank account ID, and even declare the bank account. So the bank account is equal to bank account, so query it from the database, where ID is equal to bank account ID dot first. Okay, so the reason why I use where dot first is because where returns an array, and I'd like to get the first record that it actually found in the database. If the record is not found, I return nil. I use this instead of find, because find, if you use find and you don't find a record with that particular value, ID value, then it actually throws an exception. Okay, and I'll create some validation methods under the private section of this command pattern or of this operation. So let's say I validate existence of account. Okay. So first, the validation of this is simple. If bank account is blank, then I'll add a new error message to my errors array, which is account not found. Okay, so I'll first test that validation. In the Rails console, I'll try to execute, I'll create a variable first and try to execute that operation, bank accounts, validate new transaction, dot new, let's say the amount is 10, the bank account ID or the transaction type is deposit, and the bank account ID is -1, which I don't have. Okay. Oops, I forgot to execute it, so it will actually return an array of errors and store it to the variable errors. Okay, so apparently it returned an empty errors array. Why is that? Oh, I forgot to actually call the method validate existence of account. So before returning the error, I'll call validate existence of account. Reload this. See if it still works. Okay, so now we have the value account not found inside the array. Another thing that we can validate is in the event of a withdrawal. So if transaction type is equal to withdraw and we actually found a bank account, so present. Then we validate withdrawal. We're in. The logic for validate withdrawal is to first check if the bank account's current balance minus the amount that you'd like to withdraw is less than 0, meaning you don't have enough funds to actually withdraw this particular amount from this account. Then I'll add a new error message to errors and say not enough funds. Okay. And this will actually fire if I use the transaction type withdraw. So to test that out, okay, I'll call this again, but this time I'll use the bank account ID 1, and transaction type withdraw. Remember, this bank account doesn't have any balance in it yet, so it should return an error of not enough funds, as seen right here. Okay, now that we have that operation, I'll create another operation that will actually perform the transaction. So I can name that operation perform transaction.rd. Okay. The same thing, I can actually just copy paste this operation and rename this to perform transaction. I won't need the errors array. I can assume that all of these things are present, and I'll just code the logic and execute. And I'll eventually just return the newly updated bank account after that transaction was made. Okay. So what I'll do is, align this first. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll check first if the transaction type is equal to withdraw. Then I'll create a new account transaction that contains the bank account, the amount, and the transaction type. Okay. After creating the transaction, I'll then update the bank account's balance to the initial balance, bank account dot balance. It's a withdrawal, so I'll subtract the amount from the initial balance. Else, if transaction type is equal to deposit, then I'll create the same transaction and just add to that amount. Okay, so instead of a minus, I'll use a plus. Okay, so we can actually still improve this code since we're creating transactions anyway. This thing is the exact same thing as this thing. So you can actually pull this out and put it here up front and just remove this. Okay, so our code becomes much shorter. So what this is doing is that it will first create a transaction, and then it will check if the transaction type is a withdrawal, then subtract the amount. If it's deposit, then add the amount to the bank account, and then return the bank account back to the user. Okay, so once I have those operations in place, I can go back to my API layer and use those operations. So I'll have an errors variable here and check bank accounts validate new transaction dot new, pass to it the necessary variables, and execute. Okay, since this returns an array of errors, then I can check if errors size is greater than 0, then something went wrong. So I'll render back to the user those array of errors and say that it's not a successful transaction. So you can use whatever status code prior to 200 to produce an error. else rather, render JSON, or rather, I have to perform the transaction first. So this perform transaction returns a bank account, bank accounts dot, or colon perform transaction dot new, and pass to it all these things. So it's the same thing. Pass the parameters that we just extracted from the request. Okay, so if that's successful, then I can render JSON balance bank account dot balance. Okay, I don't need to explicitly specify the status because the default is actually a status of 200. Okay, so I think we're okay with this API endpoint. What I'll do now is I'll try to consume, or I'll try to avail of this particular service or API endpoint from my JavaScript. So going back to show, okay, after I click the button save, I can issue an AJAX call whose URL is, okay, let me just define a quick URL right here. Var URL is equal, I can actually hard code it here, API v1 bank account / new transaction. Okay, I'll say URL, method is a post, data type is JSON, and the parameters that I'll have to pass to the server will be the following data: the amount, the transaction type, and the bank account ID. Upon success, okay, you can do whatever you want with the response, but for this example, I'll just simply redirect the user back to the same page. So it's basically refreshing the page of bank accounts followed by the ID of the bank account. So in this case, bank account ID. Okay. Else, if there's an error, I'd like to do the following. I'd like to have a notification section, probably in my modal, whose content will contain the array of errors that's being expected if something goes wrong when consuming this API. So I'll do something like notification.html. I have to parse the JSON. So JSON.parse response.response text, which actually contains the response body. And I'll do .errors. I know that this is an array, so I can do something like join. Okay. But of course, every time I click the save button, I'll have to empty that notification content. So HTML will just be a blank text. Now, I believe I don't have notification yet. So what I'll do is I'll declare it as another element, notification. $notification is equal to a class notification that exists inside the show page. Okay, so probably I'll put it in the modal somewhere, probably here. It's just a class, so I can do .notification. All right, so let's see if this works. Let me refresh the page, make sure no errors occur. Okay, so going back to the JS file, okay, so I'll force the system to produce an error just to see if I can actually print out the response text of errors into the application. So refresh this, new transaction, And let's say I'd like to withdraw 1,000 pesos from an account that currently has no balance. Okay, so we have an error right here. It wasn't able to parse it correctly, so most probably there was an error in the server. Okay, so we have here string can't be coerced to big decimal in validate new transaction line 24. So let's go ahead and check that out. So under transaction operations, or rather the bank account operations, validate new transaction, it said that string can't be coerced to a big decimal. So it means that I'm trying to perform some arithmetic on a string value. And I think that would be the amount. So I'll force the amount to be a floating point number. So I'll do .try to f, so it actually becomes a floating point number. Let's try that again. I'll try to withdraw 1,000 pesos from the account. Okay, so it produced an error, not enough funds, and displayed it inside the modal. Okay, the next thing I can implement is the oh, I forgot to disable the controls, or rather to enable the controls upon error. If the server throws an error, then enable the controls. Okay, so aside from the notification, I'll do enable controls. So I can try again. So for example, I'll try to withdraw 100 pesos, not enough funds, and I have the controls enabled again. Okay, so now I'll try to test the deposit. So for the deposit, if it's successful, then it will just redirect the user to the same page, which is to simply refresh the page. So new transaction, 100, and then deposit, click. Okay, so it was successful. Was it successful? No, we have a 500 internal server error. So we'll check our server out. So I think, yeah, it's the same error as the validate new transaction. We can't force the string, or we can't perform arithmetic against the string. So going to the perform transaction, we'll force amount to be a decimal number. Oh, sorry. Okay, so let me try that again. Refresh that. New transaction, deposit 500 to the account. Oh, and if you can see, the deposit, well, the deposit actually went through. Okay, because I think it hit this part of account transaction create, right? But it didn't hit this part. Okay, so I'll force the, I'll remove everything again. So I'll just delete all the transactions again. Destroy all, I think, right? My account balance is still 0. Okay, so let me try that again. I'll try to deposit 500. Okay, and then it redirects to the page and then updates the balance. So let me try the withdrawal part. I withdraw 100, save, and my balance gets updated to 400. Okay, another. If I try to withdraw 1,000, I won't have enough funds, so I'll try to deposit 1,000 instead. It should have a final balance of 1,400. Okay, so I guess that's it for this live coding session. What we have right here, just to recap, what we have right here is a Rails application from scratch that showcased how to create APIs, which is the perform transaction, and how to use the command pattern to implement business rules, as well as use the revealing pattern in the front end to make our code much shorter, or rather to organize our JavaScript, okay, making our code much more readable Although there can still be some improvement for this code since we have a very long thing right here. But we can improve it later on in the next live coding sessions. Okay. And I guess that's it. Oh, one more thing. In the show page, my HTML starts to get cluttered with a lot of stuff in it. So I'd like to decrease the HTML code as much as possible by segmenting these parts into different partials. So for example, for this table of transaction, I might have a partial called transactions, okay, which will contain this HTML block of code. And then in here, I'll just call render transactions or render partial transactions and just pass a local variable to it. So let's say locals bank account. Okay, and then I'll use that local variable here and here. Okay. All right. One thing we can also transfer will probably be the modal. So I'll render partial modal transaction. I won't have any local variable for that, so I can just copy this entire thing and create a new file called modal transaction and paste it right there. Okay, so all right, so that would be my modal transaction. And if you can see, it reduced my code in the view layer significantly. I have a bunch of partials and some header files. So if I'd like to modify, let's say, the UI of transactions table, I'll just focus on this file. If I'd like to modify the modal, how the modal looks, I'll just focus on this file, and it makes my code much cleaner. Right, so I guess that's it for the first live coding session. We implemented a working banking application that allows us to perform withdrawals and transactions and deposit transactions. Right, so if I go to bank account, 1,400 right there, and let's say I want to withdraw 200, save, refresh, and the account balance gets updated. Alright, so that's it for this first live coding session for DevLogs. In the next live session, then I'll probably improve on this application more and include more concepts for development, for Rails development. Okay, stop it right there, stop recording.